what you tend to do is compare the benefits of that project, which might occur in the future, with the current costs, which you'll have to pay up front. And because benefits are often paid out, as I say, far many days or years or months ahead, and the costs have to be borne now, in order to compare apples to apples, what you have to do is discount future future benefits to sort of their net present value in order to be able to compare them to their current costs. And of course, this becomes far more complicated if you have costs spread out over time and if you have benefits spread out over time. But the basic idea is, if costs and benefits occur at different points in time, you need to bring them together to the same period of time using some sort of discount rate. And so this discount rate is essentially something that reflects preference for immediate benefits over future ones. So most of you, I imagine, would prefer to get $1 today rather than, many of you would prefer to get $1 today rather than $1 in 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 100 years. And so much so, in fact, that many of you would be willing to accept maybe 95 cents today rather than $1 100 years in the future, right? So that now, short-termism, that desire to have things now rather than in the future, is captured by this discount rate that basically measures how much more you prefer the present to the future. So what holds true for the individual in a way also holds true for society. And so what we'll be thinking about here today is social discount rates, the sort of society-wide average of individual discount rates, known as SDR, which allows us as societies to decide whether various projects are worth it, right? To do a cost-benefit analysis that might involve many decades of planning and investment and lots of costs that have to be borne up front, for benefits showing up only many generations or many years in the future. And so that basically that's the sort of idea. We need some sort of rate to convert future benefits to the present, which allows us to compare societal costs and benefits to their present value. And this is absolutely crucial for long-term projects, right? I mean, there are projects that take 30, 40 years to construct nuclear power plants, high-speed rail, for example, various sort of canals, underwater cables, satellites, all these sort of things. And it's very difficult to say whether a project is worth it or not if you don't know what those benefits in the future will be actually worth, were they to be converted to today's money. For climate and energy, this is a crucial sort of question as well, what the social discount rate is. If you are trying to decide whether you want to invest in new types of technologies, energy technologies, say renewable energies, or whether you want to pay for carbon emission mitigation that might result in lower emissions and a safer, better world for our children and our children's children, again, you need to know what the social discount rate is. And obviously, the higher the social discount rate, the more you favor today rather than tomorrow, the more selfish you are in terms of what goes on now rather than what goes in the future. And the lower the social discount rate, the greater the future benefits. And so when it comes to a practical importance, this is huge because the social discount rate essentially determines policy in that it specifies which particular projects are actually worth it and which aren't. And, as such, it can be an extremely contentious issue because choosing a social discount rate that's just slightly different might make some projects completely unfeasible, whereas choosing one that's slightly, lower or higher might make them feasible. So there's a wonderful debate in climate sciences where there's these two great researchers, Nordhaus and Stern, and one is basically saying, the discount rate is this, the other one is saying the discount rate is this, and depending on who you believe, you will either, invest trillions of dollars into climate mitigation or not, right? And the values are super sensitive to what social discount rate you choose. So it's very, very contentious. What I'm going to talk a little bit about today is just give you a flavor of how, as economists, as politicians, we choose the level of the social discount rate, how they actually go about doing it. You know, there's theory of what economists do, and then it's how it's implemented by politicians and governments. And then I will also sort of talk a little bit about these existing foundations for a declining social discount rate. So it turns out that there's been some sort of argument for saying that, you know, the social discount rate shouldn't be constant when you're going out long term into the future. You should be taking into account that people become more patient over time for some reason, or at least the social discount rate declines over time. So we'll sort of talk a little bit about that. Also talk about the practice, the nitty-gritty, right? Because, you know, as I say, economic theories are beautiful. We all sit on a wonderful ivory tower, but at the end of the day, there's a guy in England who's been writing this book called the Green Book for the last 30 to 40 years, and de facto, he decides what the social discount rate is. Literally, he picks it out, and there's no revision. He chooses it, and so you can imagine that that's potentially an enormously powerful position. There's something similar in the US. There's something called the Circular A94, which pins down the social discount rate as well. And yeah. Then I'll sort of link this into a little bit of the work that Alex, True, and I have been doing, basically saying that actually, you know, you need to think a little bit more long-term here, right? Just looking at social discount rates at a point in time is probably not the best idea. What you need to do is see how these social discount rates have been evolving for hundreds, thousands of years to sort of get an idea of what will be happening in the future. And so we sort of argue that actually there's been a historical increase in patience. People have been getting more and more patient, caring more and more about the future. And we're going to show you some very long historical patterns. And then what we do in that paper is build a sort of micro-founded model that we calibrate and basically show where that increasing patience is potentially coming from. And we'll argue that this has some very important implications, cost-benefit analysis, and can change the calculus of what projects are worth what in the future dramatically. We'll also talk, you know, relatedly to this paper, which sort of just was published in JP Macro, we have some future projects where we're actually thinking about practical policy implications of this declining discount rate by increasing patience. What will policy look like when? What will policy look like when DDR, when you have a DDR in comparison to the world where you have a constant discount? Yeah, Margarita.
Just a general comment, because thinking of the link with intergenerational justice, right? So there is what you're saying sounds to me more like a political problem, right? Than because it's true that people might discount the future more, but one could claim that governments shouldn't, right? In the sense that they should take into consideration some intergenerational justice, and so it's actually a common idea. But how does it fit? Well, is it that you basically, in some sense, it's an overestimate? But I don't know. So you thought about this?
Oh, it's the next slide. Okay. Yeah.
So just when you're taking questions to the audience, can you repeat the questions back so that people know?
Right. Okay. Sure. So the question was about intergenerational justice and how it fits into what we're doing about, and my answer is let's talk about it right now. So there we go. So how do we typically, practically, as economists, policymakers, think about the social discount rate? You know, as Margarita sort of points out, there's been arguments about the level and the methodology going back 100 plus years. You know, Keynes, Ramsey in 1928 in Cambridge. Philosophers before that were arguing about what the right way of discounting the future is. And, you know, so there's disagreements and people fight and bicker about it all the time. It's philosophical and there's no right answer. There are just different methods. And let me sort of tell you a little bit about two of the most popular current methods that people use. The first being the social opportunity cost measure, and the other one is essentially a Ramsey rule. And the social opportunity cost measure is sort of the simplest possible method you can imagine. Basically, the social discount rate is essentially set to the prevailing market rate of return of private investment. What does that mean? You basically look at a portfolio of stocks, S&P 500, or specific individual companies. If you work, say, in an energy sector, maybe the rate of return of a portfolio of energy companies, any sort of privately traded investment, and you sort of set the social discount rate equal to that rate of return on that private investment. And this is sort of nice. It has some positive benefits in that it's market-based. So what that means is that it has access, that number incorporates vast amount of information from all the players in the market that you might not otherwise have as a social planner. It's opportunity cost-based, which is also in the name, but also very nice in that when you have, when you're a government choosing to invest in a project, you're measuring that cost of that dollar investment by what you're actually giving up in the private sector, right? So a dollar invested in the public sector can't be invested in the private sector in a way, so that opportunity cost of that dollar is that interest rate. And it's easy to implement. Pick your favorite rate of return, you're done. That's it. Right? You just go on the Financial Times website, check what the rates of return are on your favorite asset over the past 5, 10, 100 years, whatever you want it, and you're finished. Now, cons, well, yeah, exactly. Potentially, well, let me leave that to last. It may include a risk premium. What does that mean? Well, if you invest in risky stocks, I don't know, like a stock market or a specific individual stock, those stocks go up and down. Those companies go bankrupt or they boom. So you are somehow compensated when purchasing those stocks in the form of a higher rate of return in order for you to accept that risk. And so that R might actually be too high. It might include compensation for risk that basically governments with very long-term horizons might not be facing. And so you might be choosing a social discount rate that values the future too little. Right? So certain projects which might otherwise not be done by the market should be done by a government who has a longer term perspective. It's shorter term, and it's based on current market conditions. So I'm sure we're all aware of the wonderful pension valuation that took place when the market crashed. That was based on that one point in time, and it was a terrible valuation at that point in time because that R was clearly a long-term R that you should be using. It is often used for shorter-term investment. So if you have an investment that's maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months, maybe use the market-based rather than the alternative. And most importantly, though, as well, it potentially ignores ethics. So the interest rate, the private interest rate might not incorporate the decision to invest for future generations into things. And I'll talk a little bit more about ethics when I get to round zero, but basically it might not, the private interest rate, private market players might not take into account the possibility that their actions will lead to an overheating planet and destruction of the entire ecosystem 300 years from now, whereas a government might. And so that social, by basically just setting it to the private returns, you're completely getting rid of the whole idea of what is ethical and what is not. You're completely getting rid of the question of, just because individuals might discount the future, governments perhaps might not, because they're sort of taking into account all the potential future risks as well. And so that avoids that entire discussion. So what people have tended to do to try and address some of these cons is they essentially use what's known as the Ramsey rule, Euler equation. Basically, so this is something that Ramsey came up with back in late 2028, I think. He wrote down a little model, an economic model, where you had an agent within that model deciding how to invest a capital stock optimally. Basically, the choice of do I consume today or do I consume tomorrow? And based on that model, they sort of get an equation that pops out of that model that looks like this: that the interest rate or the social discount rate is equal to rho plus u times g. Maths, it's Greek, sorry about that, that's the way it's written. Basically, the idea is that this rho is the rate of time preference, right? How much you care about the future. And the lower the row is, the more you care about the future. The higher the row is, the less you care about the future. Mu G is sort of a wealth effect. So G is the growth rate of per capita consumption. So if you know that people are going to be really, really, really rich in the future, you might care about the future slightly less, right? You might sort of say, well, you know, they're going to be rich anyway. I might as well consume now. So who cares? So the interest rates might as well be high. Because that is the only way that will induce me not to consume now. And mu just determines how large that effect is. So what are the pros here? Well, it totally includes ethics in this, it includes a form of ethics through this time preference parameter. So Ramsay was the brother of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was essentially coming from a deeply religious family, even though he was hugely atheist as well. But for him, morality and ethics and philosophy and the idea of trading on time was deeply problematic. And so he basically would probably argue that this row, this preference of time, should be very, very low. Right? You should basically care about future people just as much as you care about present people. And in fact, a number of organizations like the European Union, when making their calculations, always set row to 0. Which, that's a choice. But not everybody does that. So you know, economists probably look at rho as being much larger than 0, but depending on what you view, I guess, the future, or what you view on ethics is, you can choose however large or small rho is. So in a way, it's more comprehensive than this measure because you can fiddle with it and get results that you potentially might like. And it's longer term because, again, it explains, it gives you the foundational reasons for what a social discount factor is and the basis for a social discount factor in theory, rather than just taking something that you go, you know, like a black box as private rate of return. The cons, of course, are that it's complex. So it's based on a dinky little model, and it gives you these 3 parameters that you somehow have to choose. Right? Before you just have to choose 1 parameter, and I'm telling you you need to choose 3 parameters. So how do you do that? Well, again, that's where the arguments start coming, and that's where people start saying, you know, this is the right parameter, this is the wrong parameter. But at least you're narrowing down the discussion and sort of trying to, instead of just trying to fit this black box of a social discount rate, you're trying to fit individual specific parameters. Okay? It's also important to note that it's often the case that these 2 things, in models at least, are the same, right? I mean, if you write down, like within the Ramsay model, if you have a constant rho, a constant G, a constant mu, and a representative consumer, the private rate of interest will be exactly the same as the social discount rate. The way I kind of see it is that probably the Ramsay rule is sort of correct, and what we observe here is some sort of distorted view of the social discount rate. And so that mapping between the 2 is unclear, unless you have a better, more specified model. Now, so basically what happens is that policymakers tend to adapt one of these 2 methods of calculating the social discount rate. But recently there have also been arguments that actually we should also be thinking about these things not as constant, but potentially as changing into the future. Gollier, for example, argues that growth rates, these G's, are correlated over time, or there is some uncertainty over future growth rates. When you go ahead and solve out the model and that equation that you get, the social discount rate equation that you actually get tells you that the social discount rate should decline over time. Weitzman basically says, look, people completely disagree about what the correct social discount rate is. There's a lot of people who think it's very high, there's a lot of people who think it's low, there's a lot of people in the middle, and they show that if that is indeed the case, there's a distribution of opinions about what the social discount rate is. It actually makes sense, and there's uncertainty about what the actual social discount rate is. It actually makes sense to incorporate a declining discount rate, just in case those guys who think the social discount rate is very low are right. So you can sort of write down their model where you have a distribution of social discount rates among experts, and you can sort of show that in that case, what really needs to happen is for the social discount rate to go down. Both of these explanations are kind of forward-looking, right? You're sort of thinking about things that will happen into the future. What we're going to argue is that actually social discount rates, not only will be declining in the future, but have been declining for a very long time in the past as well. And at least the argument that we're going to be making is that you need to really understand why they've been declining, rather than making sort of slightly ad hoc assumptions that these two guys make. And I'll talk a little bit about that just now. Okay, are we stuck? Hello. All right. So let me tell you a more exciting thing about, this is all wonderful, all these economic theories. Yeah. So this is wonderful. All these economic theories are great, and we can talk about them all day. How are these things determined in practice? And as usual, these things are determined completely differently in practice. So basically, if you look at what the US does, they pretty much assume a constant expected discount factor of 7% plus 3% social rate of time preference. Why? It's unclear. Someone sat down once in a committee, decided this was the right thing to do, and proceeded to sort of incorporate that into most major government decisions in the United States since 1992. It's presently under review. We'll see what happens. The Green Book is slightly better. It's certainly written by a very smart chap, and they sort of really explain what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing. But at the end of the day, it is literally an individual making that decision without any oversight whatsoever, which is just astonishing. Anyway, but basically they recommend a social discount rate of 3.5%. So, but also they introduce a somewhat ad hoc lower discount rate on projects that last 30 or 75 years or longer. So, in terms of pure social time preference, in terms of this thing over here, they say, well, we don't know if it should be 0 or 1, so we'll pick something in the middle, and they pick half. Really great justifications. So basically that's how it's done, and that's how pretty much every single project in England is decided based on these three lines. Fair enough. I mean, it takes a model and a number to beat a number. So let's think a little bit more about this. So, disagreements arise not least from limited quantitative modeling, but also from the choice and justification of choosing. So what we're going to be doing is, what we've done in a way is introduced a new way of understanding, I guess, the micro foundations of declining pure time preference. So why it is that we think people have becoming more and more and more patient as time goes on. Basically, very shortly, and I'll talk about it, what we do is we look at very long historical market rates, interest rates paid on the market, going back 1,000 years, and we show that we sort of show you that they're going down, they're decreasing, and we argue that this can in fact be interpreted as a decline in pure time preferences. And so basically people becoming more and more patient. That row over here that Ramsey was so worried about, over time is getting lower and lower and lower. We care more and more and more about intergenerational equity in a way as time goes on. So in that sense, this is going to be both relevant to the opportunity cost modeling, in that we're going to be able to understand why the private interest rate is what it is, and it's going to be relevant to the Ramsey rule, and that we're actually going to derive an extended modified Ramsey rule that is going to allow us to value, determine what the social discount rate is slightly better. So, so this is the next few slides will be from this paper. As I said, we've got it for JP Macro, and so I'll give you a little bit of a taste of what we do there to try and help you understand why we think the social discount rate is fine. So, it's not just us who've been thinking about this. There's been a lot of focus lately on trying to understand the decline in the natural rate of interest. Since about 1960, right? And the natural rate of interest, if you look at 1960 in the US, that's been 46% near zero. It's gone up now slightly, but not much.
Radek,
yes.
Sorry.
Can you explain what natural is?
Yeah. Probably the easiest thing to do is just to it's the US rate. Basically, it's what the rate is the underlying fundamental rate of interest of everybody was theoretically, all people and machines were theoretically employed and used and not standing idle. The best way to think about it is it's a representation of an acceptable level of interest rate in the US economy. So this decline of interest rate is something people have been thinking about since the 1960s. Nice, but it turns out that this decline has been going on for much, much, much longer. So this picture on the left is a lovely data series from Schmelting, who basically constructed a sort of risk-free rate of interest, global rate of interest going back to 1300 today. Where basically they show that there's been a relatively smooth decline in the rate of interest since the 1300s. And you can sort of also look at the associated paper with Roberfrost and Schmelting, and basically show that this decline has been smooth. There haven't been jumps, even with the Black Death, even with various sort of invasions and wars. These things didn't seem to make very long-lasting effects, and they were relatively smooth declines over time. And of course, fine, this is some concatenation of the safest assets available at a given point in time in the world. Very similar things hold with individual countries over time. So here are the rates of return on land from Clark, going from 10, 11, 12% in 1200 to 1 or 2% in the year 2000. And of course, you can do a whole bunch of fun. Why can't I click this? There we go. No, that's not it. Why can't I click this? Who knows? Here we go. Here are real returns on long-term sovereign debt by country: Germany, Spain, France, Britain, Italy, Japan, and India as well. All these sort of things declining over time. You can sort of look at real returns on land in individual countries. They're also declining over time. I love this table. We don't take it very seriously because we don't have this great data. And this data, have to be trusted to a certain extent, but it's not just the last 700 or 800 years. You can go back all the way to 3000 BC, and you can see that ancient Sumerians were paying 20 to 25% interest, Egyptians 9 to 12, the UK 4 to 5, and so on. So even over vast time periods, different geographies, it seems that each subsequent civilization had roughly lower rates of interest. This is more for interest. Don't take this particular slide too seriously. We don't, but I just find it so absolutely fascinating. And if you wonder where do we get this sort of data, well, you can look like Hammurabi's code, where it's written in stone that thou shalt charge X% interest or something like that. Or you can look at the little receipts that they have from Babylon saying, I charge the Bob 6% interest to get 5 of my cows for a year, and you can sort of infer interest rates from that. But we stick to the sort of the more important data in a way. We stick to these two sorts of sets of data to try and understand what's going on. So the question really fundamentally is, why in the world would this R go down? Why would interest rates go down? Okay, so we have this Ramsey rule that Frank Ramsey derived, and basically, it's one of these things that has to be changing. The most obvious thing for an economist would be to think about maybe the growth rates of the economy changing, right? Maybe over time, something has happened to growth rates that has contributed to declining rates of interest. The problem is that if you look over this period, growth rates were practically flat. There was no growth until the Industrial Revolution, when growth kicked off and growth rates went up like crazy. But that's going the wrong way. Flatten up would imply interest rates that are flatten up, but they're not, they're going down. So what you need to really start thinking of, perhaps, is that something to do with rho is changing. Okay, so one particular idea of why rho might be changing is because society as a whole is changing. And one idea that could potentially explain this is a demographic channel that was brought up by Blanchard, that maybe life expectancy has somehow been increasing, and that decreases the effective level of patients in the economy. And it turns out that that works, but only after the 19th century. Why? Because taking out death of children at birth, if you just look at, once you've survived to age 25, your life expectancy until the 19th century was pretty flat. From the 1300s to the 19th century, it didn't change very much. Only after the 19th century kicked in did it go up. And so an increasing life expectancy certainly contributed to declining rates of interest, but only after the 19th century, not before. So we need some different, perhaps, demographic channel to get at that. And what we're going to argue is that it's sort of a rise of societal patience. Okay, so let me walk you through the steps of argument without getting into the math. We have a very large swath of research showing that patience varies across individuals. Right, so there is evidence both from rich countries in Denmark, and Sweden, and France. There's evidence in Bangladesh and India. There's evidence in Botswana and South America. Experimentally validated evidence that different individuals have different levels of patience. More patience and less patience. There's also quite good evidence that there is strong intergenerational transmission of patience. Children who come from more patient parents will be more patient themselves. Now, and this, as I said, this is coming both in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and we have Sweden and Denmark and France, where this evidence is coming from. Now, we're not saying why that's the case. Obviously, it can be societal. It can be parents raise their children in such a way to reflect their cultural and their home values, if you will. It can be genetic. Maybe there's gene mutations, who knows? Or it could be a combination of the two, or anything in between. Whatever it is, we know we have very good, strong evidence over very long periods of time, especially in Sweden, showing you that patient parents have patient children quite overwhelming. And we have some small evidence as well that patience implies higher fertility. More patient agents tend to have more children. So there's theoretical models that economists have written out, Baron Becker in the 80s and 90s, where patience very clearly implies more fertility, but there is also, hard evidence for something like this. So for example, if you look at the German socioeconomic panel, a longitudinal data set, which since '84 has collected information by interview on 30,000 unique individuals in 11,000 households. What we can do is we can look at some of their responses. So there's a question asking for what is your general personal patience on a scale of 0 to 10. And this patience was asked in 2 years. And then what we can do is what that self-reported level of patience reports, how that relates to the amount of children, unique children in each household at 2008, plus any number of additional household children up to 2013. And when you sort of look at this data, it seems quite strong that, more patient households have more children. It doesn't matter on the age, it doesn't matter on how rich you are, it doesn't matter on various controls, which include things like whether you're a male or a household head, or married, or widows, divorced or separated. We've also managed to get data on education levels. None of these things seem to lower this effect that the more patient you are, the more children you tend to have. Okay, so putting these three things together, these three channels, basically says the following. People are different in patience. Different people have different kids. Based on how patient they are, more patient people have more kids, and those more patient people will tend to pass on that level of patience to their children. So over time, what we expect is the more patient people to have more patient children, and the proportion of more patient people will increase in the population. It's a very simple story, it's a very cute story, but the question is, does it make any quantitative sense? Right? So at this point, I would then flip over to the economic model and spend an hour and a half going over the economic model. But the idea is, I can explain it in words, is simply what we can do is quantitatively test whether this model, where this idea makes sense. We have data on the distribution of patients today. Right? We know what it is. We can measure patients today in the global population. So we can match our model to incorporate this distribution of patients today, and then use the model, run it back in the past based on today's distribution, and sort of start it off at 1300 and make sure that the model hits today's patients distribution, and see what that necessitates, what is necessary in order to get that when it comes to generating, what it generates for interest rates if we do indeed do that. So basically what we're doing is matching the model to today's distribution of patients, coming up with a standard model of fertility and raising children, known as the Barrow-Becker model in economics, combining those two things and see what that type of model implies for interest rate. And so, oh, that's not what I want. Where are we here? This is not right. That was the longer version. Sorry. Right. Basically, what we end up doing is calibrating this dynamic model of fertility, where agents are different, and we capture things like the population, income per capita, fertility, life expectancy, and so on. And we essentially derive an extended RAM0. Something very similar to what I showed you at the beginning, but including slightly more terms. In our world, the social discount rate is determined by these three factors. Just as before, preference of time and growth rate, but now I allow these to vary over time, right? They can change over time because they did change over time, and we'll take that into account. And also we add, because it seems from this research that life expectancy is important, we also add life expectancy. Right, so the more you live, the lower your interest rate, the lower your social discount rate. And so basically we incorporate these changing societal time preferences, growth rates, and life expectancies, and we essentially see, okay, we have data on all of these things. We have data on R, G, life expectancy. How important is each of these things in explaining the decline in rate of interest? And we basically show that these two this factor doesn't help at all. This factor helps after the 19th century, and almost all the decline comes from this first factor. So let me show you how that kind of looks. That's the interest rate. So I want you to ignore the gray line. Just look at the dashed line and the red line. So that is the change in the interest rate, red. And this sort of black line is what our model does. This middle graph is kind of what the regular Ramsey rule would do. The one without changing preferences. The one where everybody has the same time preference. There's only one type of agent, and that agent, doesn't change over time with the preferences that change. You kind of see they kind of get a decline here after the 19th century from life expectancy, but that sort of almost entirely undoes the higher growth rates that we experienced after the Industrial Revolution, and for the vast majority of the time period, flat. So what is the contribution of our mechanism, the selection, natural selection mechanism that we think about? Well, it's the difference between our Ramsey rule and the original Ramsey rule, which is essentially this decline over here, which basically captures the entirety of that decline. Of course, we do things way more sophisticated than that, and the decompositions and various things like that, but fundamentally, that's kind of this idea. This mechanism is quantitatively capable of capturing this decline. Now, it's not to say that other mechanisms aren't operating, but we're offering one potential explanation of something that might be driving what we observe. So, a couple of preliminary implications of all of this. This isn't a paper about the past, this is a paper about the future. Right? This mechanism hasn't disappeared. This mechanism is ongoing, and it sits on top of other reasons for a declining social discount rate. And just to give you an example of how important this can be for specific projects, well, consider this little thought experiment. Consider the net present value of an investment that will pay out in the future, say after n years. The relative to a constant social discount rate, or in addition to a declining discount rate for other reasons, our methodology will basically point to a 5% greater net present value if the project pays off in 50 years, and if the project pays off in 100 years, the difference in today's net present value is 20%. So to put this in perspective, if you think this is nuclear power, We make the case that, for example, maybe something like a nuclear power station is 5% better than you might have thought. If you think about maybe, I don't know, cold fusion or something like that, which might come around in 100 years, we make the case that spending 20% more on developing cold fusion makes more sense, right? And if you don't take into account this declining interest rates, you'd be spending far too little. Now, it's not to say that there aren't other factors in play. It's not to say that things like ethics shouldn't be playing more of a role here. They certainly may be, but this is on top of all those other factors, right? So this, if anything, is saying future interest rates should be lower. We should be caring more about the future than we are, because people in the future will be caring more about the future. Right? So many projects that would not be deemed affordable today suddenly become affordable if we take into account this decline. So for something so important, there's very little practical, conceptual, or empirical support or consensus on this CR. What we do is really bring together this quantitative macro-funded macroeconomic models that directly speak to some of the most important parameters in the Ramsey rule. And we've got a whole sort of, we're applying for a grant, we're doing a whole bunch of stuff where we're building directly on this paper to try and sort of think about policy in this framework. So cost-benefit analysis and intergenerational scale. And we want to make a very clear case for why it is super important to have declining social discount rates, additional to the existing rationales. And we want to look at specific projects and think about what kind of projects does this suddenly make feasible that weren't feasible before. And perhaps this can also help us understand which private investments should be done that perhaps would not have been done either. And finally, we also want to think that these aren't the only important things. There are things like risk attitudes, which should also be passed on in the same way. And we also want to sort of move over and think a little bit about that as well. But the long and short of it is, we are becoming more patient as a society. That implies that we care more about society over time. That means we should take that into account in our decisions in building long-term. And that's right. Yeah.